Welcome back to Mystara for the conclusion of the 1030 timeline, dealing with the Shadow Elves, the Nation of Sind, and the Creature Crucibles. Except for Night Howlers, that was covered in Glantry. The wars affected all the races of the known world, not just the sovereign nations, as war never changes. Some areas like Seahome were spared the ravages, but still had to deal with the aftermath. Others like Sind were devastated by them. In the finale, it's time to find out who's left, who's changed, and what was the point behind it all. I'm Mr. Welch, and turn out the light, the party's over. The Shadow Elves are the tale of two kingdoms. New Aengmor on the surface and the City of Stars deep below ground. Queen Tannadalio rules New Aengmor with a velvet glove, using all of her wits and wiles to ensure her people's prosperity. She brooks no competition because what is best for her is what's best for New Aengmor. She plays politics better than Bargle plays What Have I Got in My Pocket. Her people love her, her rivals seethe impotently, and to the outside world, she's a mystery to be unraveled. In stark contrast, her father, King Telamon, is a broken man, or elf. His grudge against the surface elves cost him his throne, primarily due to his daughter's machinations. The number of elves that remained in the City of Stars have dropped from the tens of thousands to mere hundreds, as the surface has everything the Shadow Elves could have ever hoped for. These elves cling to their hatred of the surface. No amount of good news coming from New Aengmor will change their mind. Telamon sits in an almost empty city plotting revenge on all those who have wronged him, from Alfheim to his own daughter, and the list keeps growing by the day. When the war ended, Tannadalia was in a difficult position. She had her new nation. She had the promise of friendship from half a dozen countries. She had the adoration of her people. What she didn't have was a functioning state. The elves had no infrastructure, no currency, no established relationships with any of the surrounding countries. The Shadow Elves went from lacking neighbors to sharing borders with Glantry, Effingar, and Darraken, with Alfheim just a stone's throw away. Darraken was pushing hard to help Aengmor by taking over the building of their infrastructure, but Tannadalio knew that would come with a price later. It always did. Darraken's rival in terms of economic help was Vestland. One of their generals had ascended to immortality during the war defending the elves, and the site of the battle was now holy ground for the Northmen. Rather than chase them out as her father would, the queen welcomed the humans and allowed them to establish a settlement. The Vestlanders even built a church for their new immortal, much to the consternation of Radiant Shaman Porphyriel. Shadow Elf warriors felt a bond with the Vestlanders, having fought numerous battles alongside them during the war. When Shadow Elves were found attending services at the shrine to the Northern Pantheon, the Temple of Raphael adamantly demanded its removal. Tannadalio refused because now she had leverage against the temple. She set up a trade for coins and goods for lumber. The trees of Aengmor glowed with a magical aura in the forest, but if they were cut down and shipped across the border, the aura stopped, leaving you with strangely colored logs that, while perfectly good for construction, had no magical properties at all. Aengmor wood was still highly sought after by wealthy nobles, but the initial craze they caused died down in a few years. This was after Glantry spent several large fortunes on all the wood the elves would ship. Tannadalio needed to open new markets for her people. Commonplace items were often luxuries for the Shadow Elves, and now that they were a part of the world economy, they couldn't get enough of things like glass, dyes, and all manner of food. Darraken was dealing with their shattered nation in the years after the war, so Vestland provided the majority of the initial trade goods. Merchants could cross Effingar with only minor issues, as the horsemen didn't see the point of raiding caravans loaded with nails and windows. The variety of trade goods that soon flooded New Aengmor allowed the elves to cut loose from their normal state appearance. Shadow Elf homes were often garishly decorated. Walking past one of their neighborhoods was the equivalent of being assaulted by an angry crayon box. The big one, with the sharpener. There's no sense of uniformity. Houses will be painted in bright, clashing colors according to their owners' tastes. The queen has found herself a celebrity in other nations. Some, like Glantry, want to use her in their political games. Moglai Khan is genuinely curious about her and her nation, preferring them to the humanoids they displaced. Darraken intends to eliminate the Vestland influence by providing all the support they can to the elves. King Harold of Vestland promises his people will be treated fairly in their new home. The Sylvan Elves of Alfheim are trying to keep an eye on their cousins, with distrust still running high. Other nations see the elves as either a threat or a potential ally, and they would like to know which one. Tannadalio loves playing political games. She has announced her desire to take up a consort and created a bit of a scandal by allowing herself to be openly courted by a Vestland chief instead of a Shadow Elf. That has become a show for her. She will frequently attend foreign functions with new eye candy on her arm. She's particularly fond of short bald men, as they're very grateful. But powerful Shadow Elves and other times local power players trying to ingratiate themselves to New Aengmor will be her choice. She's a fixture at the Darraken masked balls and has been entertained as far away as Thyatus. Her people might still be wary of outsiders, but she's embraced her role as queen and all the attention it brings. The more people spend to buy her attention, the more wealth she provides for her people. King Telamon, on the other hand, never gets invited anywhere. He sits on his throne and broods over his lost power. All the shamans have left, leaving him complete control of a city that doesn't even have 5% of its original population. Entire neighborhoods sit vacant. Even the soulstone mines lie unworked. Not that it matters, the soulstones started to disappear with the creation of the Aengmor forest. The other Shadow Elf cities have been abandoned, with all their remaining citizens moving to the City of Stars. He still wants to destroy Alfheim, but he won't be invading anyone with less than 1,000 followers. His daughter tried to placate him by turning over a prisoner of war who knew the way to the fabled lost city of Aengmor. The prisoner wasn't lying. He led the king and a few of his followers to the lake of lava that the city floated on. The king now had a target he could actually conquer. He executed the prisoner before returning to tell his followers of his discovery. The city held thousands of humanoids, but they could be routed with the right spells and planning. Telamon started seeking knowledge to gain the upper hand in the coming battle. He found his answer in the former temple of Raphael. The temple had been cleaned out, with all the texts and even the trappings relocated to the surface temple. But Telamon found a secret room that he never even suspected, and on the walls of the room of the deepest part of the temple was the 15th verse of the Refuge of Stone, the one telling the secret of the Soul Stones. Telamon had been lied to. The spirit shamans had deceived him, deceived his people, the same people that turned their back on him. That night he recanted his loyalty to Raphael, to the temple, and swore to retake his rightful place as the head of the Shadow Elves, tearing his traitorous daughter from her throne. He dreamed of a feathered serpent that night, one that promised to give him everything he needed as long as he obeyed. As a gift, the king would be given the city of Aengmor as his throne while he plotted his revenge. The next day, a poison mist choked the lost city once more. The day after, Telamon claimed it as his own. Sind is a nation that has left itself at a crossroads of its own making. They have been conquered twice in the last few years, being the first nation to fall in the War of the Master, and again when Alphatia occupied them afterwards, under the guise of keeping an eye on Hool. These occupations devastated Sind culture, as the Master grabbed anyone he wanted to serve as cannon fodder in the war, regardless of caste. Alphatia was only there to gather resources. They didn't even bother enforcing caste laws. Something was going to break between the crippling poverty and the destruction of their normal way of life. The occupation by Hool was as brutal as you could imagine. The Master's true target was Darrakin, but he needed Sind's resources to do so. The Raja Daraja was known as a vain and ineffectual leader. When he realized he was being invaded, he'd already lost a quarter of his nation. The Master's scorched earth tactics against any town that resisted caused the complete surrender of Sind by the Raja Daraja to save what little forces he had left. The Master then put everyone to work in the mines or the fields to support his army. Caste didn't matter, with the exception of the Rashia caste. Sind's clerics and wise men were hunted down and exterminated to prevent their interference with the Master's plans. High caste Hamaya were forced to till the fields with the untouchable Kuyila. Resistance was punishable by death. Slow work was punishable by death. Everything was punishable by death. Sind had a large population. Workers could be replaced. When Hool was defeated, Alphatia arrived in its place. It promised it was there to liberate Sind, not to occupy it. It then proceeded to occupy Sind. It wasn't a brutal conquest. The Alphatians let the Sindhi govern themselves. They were just there to grow food and mine ore for the Empire. They paid the Sindhi workers. They didn't enforce Alphatian law and essentially left the people alone. The problem was they weren't rebuilding the shattered nation past what it was needed to transport goods and food. If a region wasn't crucial to the wizards, that region didn't receive help. Alphatia's civil war changed everything for Sind. The war for Xandar started to turn against him, so he began relocating troops from Sind back to the Empire. At first it was just reserve forces, then entire garrisons. Eventually there was just a skeleton crew left to make sure the food and minerals were transported, and even then, they were recalled. Sind was liberated, not through their actions or the intervention of an ally, but by simple neglect. The Raja Chandra Ulnervi found himself again the uncontested ruler of Sind. He tried to reinstate the caste system as it once was, but the crimes of the Hoolians made that impossible. The priest caste was all but gone. The warriors of the ruling caste would usually keep order, but they were almost eradicated during the war. This left most of the power to the lower castes, specifically the Prajaya, the working caste, and the Untouchables. But with the Alphatians gone, Ulnervi didn't have the troops to control the population. The lower castes demanded more power in the government, and when Ulnervi refused, a revolution broke out. The Sind Revolution was brief. There were far more lower classes than upper classes. Without warriors or clerics to pacify the Untouchables, they ran through the streets looting businesses and sacking government buildings. Ulnervi abandoned his throne almost immediately, relocating to the city of Kandraputra before abdicating. The revolution was a complete success. Now Sind is ruled by a parliament, with a minister-appointed head of state. It isn't efficient, but it works for the populace. Sind is still crippled from the war, even decades later. Darrican has help, but only once they had recovered. There was still some resentment from the formerly higher caste nobles, and the nation has a habit of descending into mob rule. Though the easternmost cities are considered stable, Sind's overall situation has its neighbors watching very closely. Under the ocean, the kingdom of the Tritons and Marrow were safe from the wars above, but were still dealing with their own problems. Queen Tarovro is pressed on all sides by her enemies. On the surface, Minrathad harasses the sea people and is openly hostile to the Kana. The Devilfish are raising an undead army to crush Seahome, and there's little she can do to stop it. Her army, while substantial, is badly outnumbered by the undead forces outside her borders. Worse, the most significant force in her army, the Sharkkin, are notoriously unreliable. She has no allies because of her distrust of surfacers, meaning she has to figure out how to save her kingdom, and she's rapidly running out of options. Or until an unusual opportunity came up with the start of hostilities between Minrathad and Vestland. The Sea People were not friends with the Vestlanders. The northern nation was a stranger to the queen and her vassals. But they were fighting Minrathad and often winning. When the Kana approached the strangers, after some translation issues, the humans were keen to open up trading. They were new to the area, and they were trying to open up any market they could. The number of goods exchanged was minimal, but it showed Tarovra that at least these surfacers wouldn't attack her people on sight. Besides, the enemy of her enemy was her friend. She sent a portion of her army to aid the Vestlanders in their war. At first there were some problems. She didn't tell her erstwhile allies that she was supporting them. Tritons, Marrow, and Kana showed up on the surface battles and started attacking Minrathadian shipping. There were several accidental casualties due to miscommunication on both sides, but eventually the commanders from Seahome and Vestland started coordinating attacks to significant effect. In addition to military aid, the Tritons started showing the Vestlanders new shipping routes, allowing them to reach distant ports while avoiding hostile actions, at least on the surface. Many of these new routes led right over Devilfish territory. The Queen was rather curious how the Vestlanders could handle themselves against the undead hordes. The Northmen fought with brutality that the Tritons had never seen. While the guilds avoided combat at all costs to avoid damaging goods, Vestlandic sailors were warriors, one and all. The first encounter with the Devilfish tested the Vestlanders, but they fought off the ambush due to their Godar, or clerics, that accompanied every ship. Rather than try to find new routes, the Vestlanders next time just brought more Godar. The Triton forces started following Vestland ships, waiting for the humans to be attacked by undead from below before flanking their hated enemy. Soon the Devilfish started attacking Vestland's shipping out of spite more than anything else. The windows for these attacks was narrow, as once the ships got past a certain point, the Irendi navy would intervene, and the Devilfish would be completely outclassed. Queen Tarovra realized the Vestlanders were her trump card. She disliked them less than other humans, but she saw them as a tool. To stop the Devilfish, she needed to curtail their necromancy, which meant she needed to acquire one of the relics they used to control the undead on an unheard-of scale. She used spies to inform the Devilfish of a massive merchant fleet coming directly overhead in a few days, and then told the Vestlanders that the Devilfish were massing to wipe them out, so bring every ship they had. Her plan worked perfectly as the Northerners fought desperately to put down the swarms of skeletons and zombies swarming their ships. Their Godar blasted them to dust as best they could, but the undead were in the tens of thousands. All the while, the Triton forces held back, waiting for the right moment. In desperation, a powerful Godi of Thor called down a massive lightning storm into the ocean. One of the vampiric Devilfish high priests was caught in the blast, the one that controlled the Orb of Nyx. With his death, the orb sank to the bottom, right into the hand of her Triton scouts. At the cost of hundreds of human lives, Queen Tarovra had her weapon. The gnomish city of Serraine was literally above it all during the wars that ravaged the known world. The city was technically neutral in both wars and never took part in any battles between Thaiatis and Alphatia. They didn't extend the same neutrality to Hool. More than once, the Serrainian patrol craft accidentally dropped explosives on the Master's forces. It's not like the Hoolian forces could fight back. Some of their clerics did pose a threat to low-flying aircraft, and the gnomes quickly noticed, but their involvement never got past petty sniping, mainly because the city was never armed for war. It didn't have the weapons to fight the Master on a large scale. After the war, the city helped its allies rebuild the best it could. It was always dependent on resources from the ground, so it couldn't provide much in the form of material assistance. But it could give fast transportation better than anyone. If the Chancellor of Darrican needed to meet with the King of Keramikos, a Serraine cloud cutter could get him there in hours instead of a week. The gnomes made several of their flying craft available for use by their allies, leading to the construction of buildings and facilities in Darrican, Keramikos, and the Shires to handle gnomish airships. Serraine's contribution to the Western Alliance's recovery was small but vital. Serraine was then called upon to support the retaking of Falun shortly after Darrakin had largely righted itself. The city had always promised their ground-based cousins any assistance in liberating their homeland, something the Gnomish Symposium held them to. When the time came, the inventors and investors that planned the invasion provided Serraine's air force with all manners of upgraded weapons. The planes were kitted out with incendiary bombs, miniature death engines that looked like the Ak-Ak guns on the city, and new payloads to be dropped on the kobolds once they were flushed out from the mountains. The assault on Falun went well. Too well, it turned out. The ground forces marched into the caverns, with the kobolds unable to put up any defense against the superior Gnomish technologies. When the kobolds fled from the caves on the opposite side of the invasion, the Serraine gnomes hit them with everything they had, which turned out to be everything from poison gas to bombs that unleashed gargantuan fire elementals when they hit the ground. The pilots wanted to take their ancestral home back, but many were sickened at the sight of kobolds being dissolved by airdropped green slime. Serraine dispatched 2 sorties during the attack, and when the Symposium called for a third, the pilots refused. The kobolds were routed. The battle was already a massacre. The Symposium was turning it into a feeding frenzy. After several terms, Mayor Keltander retired from service to spend time with his family. In the ensuing election, the chief librarian Matazumi surprised everyone with a convincing landslide. This was rather noticeable because he wasn't even running. The Skull Druge tried to refuse the position, but the laws prohibited him from resigning. Besides, he was the only creature in the entire city that not only read the 3,000 volumes that were Serraine's Code of Laws, but he also understood them. He was released from his service as the librarian so he could perform his duties as mayor. Matazumi surprisingly pleased everyone due to his ability to work without tiring. He constantly complained about his job. He didn't sign up for this, and the city council didn't even understand the laws they were passing. He was elected a second time without campaigning for the position, and then a third time despite him actively campaigning for his opponent. He wasn't sure if it was because he was the best creature for the job or because nobody else wanted the job. The city thrived under his leadership. Tourism slowly rose, gnome-related disasters fell, and he removed over 1,000 volumes of redundant laws from the books. He began to look at the city's population as his people and felt good about himself, and then almost gagged and swore never to do that again. What can be said about the Fey folk in terms of mortal conflicts? For the most part, they didn't care. These were creatures that had been around since the beginning of the world. They had seen the rise and fall of Blackmore, saw the elemental chaos as a thrill ride more than a natural disaster. A short war that didn't even last a decade was half a blink of an eye for most of them. A few were drawn into the conflict, mainly the Nunnehay, when the Master encroached on their territory. They taught him a hard lesson about what happens when the forest starts speaking Sylvan. The Fey that willingly took part in either war did it only because they thought it would be fun. They had their favorites, to be sure. If the Hulian forces had made it into Alfheim in any number, they would have been in for a rude surprise. The Green Knight Bregbethels guarded a lone bridge in the Shires against a column of humanoids on a lark. After a number of lengthy duels, he sent all their champions into the river below to stall their advance. He was never really in any danger. The fights took as long as they did because he wanted them to feel like they were trying. When New Aengmor rose from the Broken Lands, many Fey and Sylvan races migrated to it. It was a mysterious force with discolored trees, strange new elves, and a curious magic that permeated it. It drew in the wilder Fey like moths to a flame. While they didn't have any magic spots like Alfheim, it would only be a matter of time. The only archfey to claim it as her territory was Mob, Queen of Dreams and Nightmares. The blue-tinted trees reminded her of the night sky, a place she called home. Oberon saw the war as an opportunity. To be fair, he sees everything as an opportunity. During a jaunt to the city of Sigil, Robin Goodfellow learned of a powerful artifact that Oberon could use for a very specific task. The problem was getting it. Oberon had plenty of enemies, and if he started poking around the multiverse to find this artifact, his enemies, or worse, his wife, might notice his absence from the Fey court. To this end, he sent Ariel to place a relic capable of opening up portals to other worlds in a place where it could be found. While this relic could open gates to exact locations, it could only be activated in an order that Oberon had prearranged. Once that was done, he quickly wrote up a journal about his creation, and again had Ariel place it in the royal library in the Alphatian Palace. When the Empress overlooked the book, he had to personally nudge it off the shelf to hit her in the head. Invisibly, of course. The relic worked precisely as planned, though he had to help the poor Alphatian captain sent to retrieve it by having several of his most trusted warriors open a path to the relic by secretly eliminating most of the Skrull guards in the fortress between the captain and the relic. The first portal opened directly in front of an elven fleet and let everyone know where the captain was. Since Oberon previously had Krethilev name-drop the relic's power across the multiverse, he knew the vain god Lorathian couldn't resist trying to seize it. The next portal put the airship right in front of Lathraian, but also drew the attention of an orc god who hated the elf almost as much as Oberon did. This cat's paw knocked the artifact from Lathraian's possession right onto the airship. But as soon as that happened, the relic activated again, and the new position made the captain halt his ship upon transition, vaulting the artifact into a poorly defended city in the ethereal plane. Then Oberon's plan was all but done. He let it slip to a Thaetian cleric about the city's location and had Mob enter the dreams of one of the city's speakers to convince her to betray her adopted home and wait for the empires to do what empires do best. The artifact was brought back to Thyatis by the cleric in triumph, where Oberon later acquired it from the Church of Vanya in exchange for enabling their conquest of the ethereal city. Robin Goodfellow was right about the elven artifact. It fit Oberon's needs precisely. He placed it in the spot that he had carefully chosen years previously, and it worked perfectly. Maybe now his wife Titania would stop constantly complaining about the door creaking shut. That wraps up the 1030 timeline. I had no idea when I started this it was going to take 7 episodes. I'll merge it into a single video later. It's going to be over 2 hours long, but it will be great for long trips. I've lost track of the number of characters I've killed, but I've wrapped up multiple storylines and opened up even more. Hope you enjoyed it. Now I'm back on track, and the new video is all about the city of Aengmor, the humanoid Aztec place floating on a lake of lava. But until then, remember, never piss off the man that puts the dick in vindictive.